The quarterly meeting was already tense. Numbers glowed on the projector screen, sales charts rising and falling like a heartbeat. Someone mentioned that client retention was up 4 points. That should have been good news, but the room felt tight, waiting for something, or someone. When Blake Hensley walked in, the mood shifted. He was the dealership's golden boy, the closer. Everyone at Ridgeview Motors knew him by that title. He strutted through the glass doors like he owned the place, a latte in one hand, his Rolex catching the fluorescent light. For years, Blake had ruled the sales floor. He sold the dream. German engineering, Italian leather, polished chrome, and he sold it well. But this Monday morning was different. The usual laughter near the espresso machine had dimmed. Conversations hushed when he passed. A few coworkers whispered near the service desk, eyes flicking toward the conference room. Something was changing. A new general manager was starting today, and rumor had it, she wasn't like the others. Blake smirked when he saw the name on the agenda, Camille Torrance. He didn't know her, but he already had opinions. In his mind, the auto business was a man's world. A woman, especially a black woman, running a luxury dealership didn't fit the image he'd built for himself. Inside the conference room, the team gathered around a long mahogany table. The air smelled of coffee and leather. The regional director, Greg Turner, stood at the front, smiling as he spoke. "This is Miss Torrance," Greg said, his tone proud. "She's joining us from Charlotte, where she led her team to record-breaking sales 2 years in a row. We're excited to see what she brings to Ridgeview." Camille stepped forward. She was poised and confident, but not overbearing. Navy suit, hair neatly pinned, voice steady. "Thank you, Greg," she began. "I've heard great things about this team. My focus will be on customer relationships, building trust, and updating our sales approach for the modern buyer." Her voice carried warmth and authority, but Blake barely listened. He leaned back, half grinning, muttering something to the salesman beside him. A few low chuckles rippled down the table. Camille noticed but didn't break her rhythm. "Luxury isn't just about the car," she continued. "It's about the experience, how a client feels the moment they walk in to the moment they drive off the lot." Blake cut her off. "With all due respect," he said, his tone dripping with arrogance, "this is a male-driven business. You're a woman. You probably don't understand how this works." The air cracked. Every conversation stopped. A pen dropped. The receptionist swallowed hard. Camille met his gaze. No anger, no shock, just composure. "Thank you for your input, Mr. Hensley," she said evenly. "I'm sure we'll have plenty of time to discuss our perspectives later. For now, let's stay on topic." Her voice didn't waver. She didn't raise it. She simply continued, finishing her presentation as if nothing had happened. But everyone in that room knew something had changed. Blake leaned back, chuckling under his breath, trying to reclaim control, but it was gone. The room's energy had shifted, away from him. When the meeting ended, people filed out in silence. Blake checked his phone, pretending nothing was wrong. A few coworkers gave him awkward glances. "Man," someone whispered near the door, "that was rough." Camille stayed behind, organizing her notes. Greg approached quietly. "You handled that well," he said. She smiled faintly. "It's not the first time I've dealt with something like that," she replied. Then with a calm certainty, she added, "But it will be the last. Here." That line stayed with Greg long after she left the room. He watched her walk out with quiet determination. He could tell she wasn't someone to underestimate. Down the hall, Blake was already spinning the story. "People are too sensitive," he told the finance manager. "I was just being honest. This business runs on instinct, not feelings." A few steps away, 2 employees exchanged a look. They'd seen the way Camille carried herself, measured, deliberate, professional. They knew this wouldn't just fade by lunchtime. By the afternoon, the whispers had spread. Some said Blake had gone too far. Others said Camille would shrug it off. No one said it outright, but everyone knew something had been set in motion. Camille spent the rest of the day visiting each department. Service, finance, customer care, asking questions, listening carefully. She never mentioned the meeting. Her calmness wasn't silence, it was precision. When she returned to her office that evening, she sat at her desk and opened her laptop. Her fingers moved steadily over the keys. She typed up a detailed report, date, time, witnesses, and Blake's exact words. Then she attached it to an email addressed to Human Resources and the regional director. The subject line read, "Workplace Conduct Concern." She hesitated only for a second, then clicked send.
That email would be the spark that started a storm no one at Ridgeview Motors saw coming. The next morning, the dealership felt different. The usual buzz of chatter had been replaced by a heavy quiet. No one laughed by the espresso machine. No one bragged about weekend sales or game scores. Instead, conversations dropped to murmurs when Blake entered a room. He noticed immediately. Normally, people greeted him with easy smiles, handshakes, hey man, how was the game? Not today. His coworkers offered quick nods, then turned away. Blake tried to brush it off, tried to convince himself nothing had changed, but the tension followed him, from the showroom to the break room. Even his reflection in the glass door seemed to look back at him differently. Around noon, Greg called him into his office. HR was on a video call. Camille sat to the side, calm as ever. Blake's smirk faltered when he realized this wasn't a routine check-in. Greg's tone was firm, professional. Blake, a formal complaint was filed regarding yesterday's meeting. Blake scoffed. You're kidding me. Over one comment, I was joking. Everyone knows I didn't mean it. Camille said nothing. She didn't need to. Greg sighed. We take this seriously. HR will conduct a full review. Until then, you're on administrative leave. The words hit harder than Blake expected. He tried to argue, to charm, but the silence in the room swallowed his confidence. By the time he walked out, people were already whispering again. This time, not about Camille, but about him. For the first time in years, Blake Hensley, the closer, had nothing left to close. And somewhere behind her office door, Camille Torrance exhaled quietly, not in triumph, but in relief. The message had been sent, not just through HR, but through the culture of Ridgeview Motors itself.
The silence followed Blake everywhere. Inside his office, he loosened his tie and stared at his reflection in the tinted glass. Overreacting, he muttered to himself. Everyone's just being dramatic. Then came the knock. Hey, Blake, said Lydia Chun, the HR coordinator, stepping into the doorway with her clipboard. Do you have a minute? He forced a grin. Sure thing, Lydia. What's up? It's about yesterday's meeting, she said gently. There's been a concern raised regarding a comment you made. We're doing a standard review. Blake chuckled, leaning back in his chair. A concern? Come on, Lydia. You've known me for years. I was joking. Camille knew I was just trying to break the ice. Lydia didn't smile. She just made a note on her clipboard. I understand. Still, we're required to document it. HR will schedule a follow-up. He waved a hand dismissively. Do what you have to do. As soon as she left, he cursed under his breath. He didn't realize how many people had heard the full exchange, or how many had been waiting for someone to finally call him out. Meanwhile, in her office across the hall, Camille Torrance scrolled through her morning emails. Among them was a message from HR confirming receipt of her report. The tone was formal but clear. Thank you for bringing this to our attention. We'll begin our review immediately. She closed the email and exhaled slowly. It wasn't satisfaction she felt. It was resolve. Camille hadn't joined Ridgeview Motors to fight internal battles, but she wasn't about to pretend she hadn't heard what she heard. By mid-morning, she made her way to the showroom floor. Conversations stopped as she passed. A few greeted her politely. Others avoided eye contact altogether. She smiled anyway, asking questions about customer experience and inventory tracking. When she walked away, one young salesperson whispered, "She's not playing around." Another replied, "Good. Maybe it's time someone shook this place up." Not everyone felt that way. Later that afternoon, Blake met his co-worker and longtime friend, Sean Radcliffe, by the vending machine. Sean was the kind of guy who tried to stay neutral, but couldn't resist a bit of drama. "Hey, man," Blake said, grabbing a soda. "You hearing the nonsense going around?" "Seanstrag. About the meeting?" "Yeah, people are talking." "Talking about what?" Blake demanded. "I said one thing. One, and suddenly I'm the villain?" Sean lowered his voice. "You called your new boss incompetent in front of everyone, Blake. That's not going to fly anymore." "She's overreacting," Blake said sharply. "It's corporate politics. HR will do their dance, then it'll blow over. Sean hesitative. You sure about that?" Word is she filed officially, and Greg's backing her. That hit a nerve. Blake crushed the soda can in his hand, tossing it hard into the trash. "Unbelievable. I built this place. I'm the reason Ridgeview even hit their targets last year. Sean gave a small, uneasy glance. Maybe, but times are changing, man. He walked away, leaving Blake alone in the hallway with the hiss of the soda machine echoing in his ears. By late afternoon, the whispers had spread beyond the sales floor. The receptionist overheard two finance associates mentioning that corporate had requested documentation. Blake caught fragments of their conversation as he passed. The words complaint, investigation, disciplinary review, each one slicing deeper. He stormed into Greg Turner's office without knocking. "Greg, what's going on?" "I'm hearing rumors that HR's involved now." Greg sighed, closing his laptop. "Blake, sit down." "I'm not sitting," Blake snapped. "I've been here 10 years. One comment, and suddenly I'm on trial." "Listen," Greg said evenly. "Camille followed proper procedure. HR has to investigate. It's out of my hands. So you're siding with her now?" "I'm not siding with anyone," Greg replied, voice calm but firm. "But I saw what happened in that room. You crossed the line." Blake glared at him. "You've changed, man. Everyone's changed. You can't even talk freely anymore without someone crying harassment." Greg's voice softened. "No one's saying you can't talk. But you can't insult your boss in front of the entire team and expect nothing to happen." The tension between them thickened. Greg glanced at his watch. A clear signal the conversation was over. Blake left the office fuming, his jaw clenched tight. He walked past his co-workers without looking at them, but he could feel their stares like heat on his back. As he reached his office, his phone buzzed. A message from HR. "We'd like to schedule a formal meeting with you tomorrow at 10 a.m. He shoved the phone into his pocket, trying to ignore the weight in his chest. But for the first time, a flicker of doubt crept in. Maybe this wasn't going away after all. That night, Blake sat in his driveway, the car engine idling softly. The dashboard glow reflected his face, pale and drawn. Inside the house, the porch light flickered, his wife, Janet, waiting by the door. He couldn't bring himself to go in. His pride told him he'd done nothing wrong, that everyone was overreacting, that the world had gotten too sensitive. But somewhere deeper, beneath the noise of excuses, a small, uncomfortable truth began to whisper. Maybe he had gone too far. He shut off the engine, sitting in the darkness. His phone vibrated again, an unread email from HR with formal inquiry in the subject line. He didn't open it. Not yet. Tomorrow would come soon enough. Blake barely slept that night. He kept replaying the meeting in his mind. Camille's calm expression, Greg's disappointed stare, the dead silence that followed his words. Every time he closed his eyes, the scene played again like a bad dream he couldn't escape. By morning, exhaustion had settled into his bones. He dressed slower than usual, fumbling with his cufflinks, his hands trembling slightly as he knotted his tie. "It's ridiculous," he muttered to his reflection. "It's just HR doing their job." But deep down, he knew this meeting wasn't like the others. Downstairs, Janet was pouring coffee. She looked up when he entered the kitchen. "You're quiet this morning," she said softly. Blake managed a thin smile. "Big day." She studied him for a moment. "Everything okay at work?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, just a misunderstanding." But his voice lacked conviction, and Janet noticed. She didn't press further. She just handed him a mug of coffee, her hand brushing it for a brief second. Steady, warm, human. Blake took a slow sip, staring into the dark liquid, like it might offer answers. He didn't know it yet, but the next few hours would decide his future at Ridgeview Motors and force him to face the man he'd become. The meeting. "Just tired," Blake said, grabbing his briefcase. Janet frowned. "Is it about work?" He hesitated. "Some nonsense. A misunderstanding. HR wants to talk to me." "About what?" He forced a short laugh. "You know how corporate gets. New manager, new rules. I made a comment she didn't like, that's all." "What kind of comment?" she asked carefully. "Nothing serious," he said, shrugging. "I just said something during a meeting, and she took it the wrong way." Janet studied his face. "Blake, you've always been confident. Sometimes too confident. Maybe it's time to think before you speak. He sighed, irritation flashing across his face. You sound like them now. I sound like someone who doesn't want you to lose your job, she said softly. He didn't reply. He just grabbed his coffee and left. The drive to work felt longer than usual. The radio was on, but he didn't hear a word. At 10 sharp, Blake stepped into the HR conference room. Lydia Chun sat beside Mark Sheffield, the HR director. Greg Turner from upper management was there too. Camille wasn't present, and that small fact gave him a flicker of relief. Morning, Blake said, trying to sound casual. Mark gestured to the chair across the table. Thanks for coming in, Blake. We just need to go over a few things. Lydia opened a folder. We received a formal report from Ms. Torrance regarding a comment made during yesterday's meeting. We also have statements from 3 employees who confirmed what was said. Blake leaned back in disbelief. You're kidding me. People are actually writing statements now? Over one comment. Greg spoke carefully. Blake, this isn't about one comment. There have been previous concerns about your behavior in meetings. What concerns? He demanded. Mark interjected smoothly. We reviewed your file. There are notes from 2021 about an incident involving a female sales associate, and another from last year about an argument with a customer over a financing issue. Blake shook his head. Those were handled. None of that matters. It matters now, Mark said evenly. It shows a pattern of behavior. Ms. Torrance followed procedure by filing a report. We have to take it seriously. Blake could feel the walls closing in. You're all making me sound like some kind of monster. No one's saying that, Greg replied calmly. But you cross a line. Blake slammed his hand on the table. I built this dealership's reputation. I trained half the people out there, and now I'm being crucified because someone didn't like my tone. Lydia closed the folder. We're not here to debate it, Blake. We just need your acknowledgement that you understand the situation. HR will complete its review and notify you of the outcome. He stared at her, stunned. That's it? You're just going to let her ruin my career. Camille isn't ruining anything, Mark said firmly. You are. Silence filled the room. Greg shifted uncomfortably, but no one else spoke. Finally, Mark stood, signaling the meeting was over. Blake walked out without another word. He didn't even go back to his office. He drove aimlessly, not knowing where to go, just away from it all. The city blurred past, gray and unwelcoming. Eventually, he pulled into a small diner off Interstate 85. He sat in a corner booth, a cup of coffee cooling in front of him. His phone buzzed over and over. Texts from coworkers. What happened? You okay? He ignored them all. After a while, he called an old friend, Nick Ramsey, who used to work at Ridgeview before moving to Florida. Blake, man, what's going on? Nick said, voice laced with concern. I saw a post floating around LinkedIn. Your dealership's hiring a new manager. Didn't know it was drama. Blake rubbed his temples. Drama's an understatement. This woman's got HR wrapped around her finger. Said I disrespected her. Now I'm being investigated like I'm some criminal. Nick sighed. You said something you shouldn't have? I just told her this is a male-driven business, Blake said bitterly. That's not offensive, that's reality. Yeah, Nick said slowly. Except it sounds offensive when you say it out loud. Especially now. Blake frowned. You're kidding me. You're on her side, too. I'm on the side that keeps you employed, Nick replied. You've been in this game long enough to know times are different. You can't talk like that anymore. Blake didn't answer. He hung up after a few seconds, tossing the phone onto the seat beside him. He sat there for hours, watching people come and go. Truckers, families, a young couple laughing over milkshakes. The world outside kept moving. But for him, everything felt stuck, suspended in a kind of quiet humiliation. By evening, he finally drove home. Janet was waiting at the door. How did it go? She asked quietly. He shrugged. They're reviewing it. Blake. She began, but he cut her off. Don't. I don't want to talk about it. She nodded slowly and turned away, leaving him standing there in the hallway. He poured himself a drink, sat on the couch, and stared at the blank television screen. The silence in the house felt heavier than usual. His mind replayed every meeting, every careless joke, every sarcastic comment that might have landed wrong. He thought of Camille's steady eyes across the conference table, her calmness as she'd taken notes. For the first time, the thought crept in, maybe it wasn't everyone else who had changed. Maybe it was him who hadn't. He took another drink, the ice clinking softly against the glass. The next morning came gray and still. Blake arrived at Ridgeview Motors before anyone else. He wanted to prove something, to himself, to them, maybe to no one at all. He parked his silver BMW right out front in the customer section. Just like always, it was a silent declaration. I'm still here. He walked inside, nodding to the receptionist, but she barely looked up. Two salesmen near the espresso machine went quiet when he passed. The air felt different, thinner somehow. Blake straightened his tie, trying to shake the feeling. He wasn't done yet. He'd built this place. He wouldn't go down without a fight. He made it to his office, sat behind his desk, and stared at the dealership floor through the glass wall. The showroom lights gleamed off the polished cars, but everything felt distant, unreal. Then his phone buzzed. Subject: termination review. Immediate attendance requested. Blake's stomach sank. He didn't move at first, just stared at the screen. The world outside kept turning. Salesmen laughing. Phones ringing. The usual noise of a normal morning. But for him, time had finally stopped. He closed his eyes, exhaled slowly, and stood up. It was over. The fall. The receptionist avoided meeting his eyes. Blake gave a tight smile and walked toward his office, pretending not to notice. Before he reached the door, his phone buzzed. Meeting reminder. HR review, 9 a.m., conference room B. He sighed, straightened his jacket, and headed down the hall. Inside, Lydia Chun and Mark Sheffield, the HR director, were already seated. This time, Camille Torrance sat across the table, calm and poised, her tab in front of her, hands folded neatly. Morning, Blake said, forcing a smile. Good morning, Camille replied evenly. Mark gestured to a chair. Please have a seat. Let's get started. Blake sat slowly, every motion deliberate, as if to prove he wasn't intimidated, but his pulse was racing. Mark began, voice steady. We've concluded our review of the complaint filed last week. After interviewing staff and reviewing your employment record, we identified multiple incidents that reflect conduct inconsistent with company values. Blake crossed his arms. Let me guess, someone didn't like my tone again. Lydia glanced at Camille, then back at him. It's not just tone, Blake. The remark you made during the meeting was inappropriate and discriminatory. Several employees said they were uncomfortable. He laughed under his breath. Uncomfortable? We sell six-figure cars to millionaires, Lydia. You think people here are that fragile? Camille spoke for the first time since he entered. Her voice was calm but firm. This isn't about fragility, Mr. Hensley. It's about respect. You question my competence in front of the entire team because of my gender. That's not leadership. It's disrespect. She didn't sound angry, just certain. That certainty irritated him more than any accusation could. Look, Blake said, leaning forward. You're new here. You don't understand the culture. I was joking. Everyone knows me. Mark cut in. Intent doesn't erase impact, Blake. The company's position is clear. He scoffed. So what now? You writing me up? I'll take the slap on the wrist. Lydia inhaled slowly and slid a folder across the table. This isn't a write-up, she said softly. It's a termination notice, effective immediately. For a moment, Blake just stared at it, blinking. You're firing me? Yes, Mark said simply. You're being let go for violating workplace conduct policy. You will receive your final paycheck, including unused vacation time, within the week. The room fell silent, except for the faint hum of the air conditioner. Blake felt his throat tighten. After 10 years, he said quietly, this is how you do it? Greg Turner, who had been sitting near the door the whole time, finally spoke. Blake, I try to vouch for you, but there's too much history, too many complaints. HR's decision is final. Blake turned toward Camille, anger flashing in his eyes. You wanted this, didn't you? You couldn't handle being challenged. Camille didn't flinch. I didn't want you fired, Blake. I wanted accountability. There's a difference. Her words hung in the air, sharp, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. Blake's face flushed red. He slammed his hand against the table. This place is finished without me. You'll see. Please, Lydia said softly. Let's keep this professional. He rose, towering over the table. You're making a mistake. All of you. Mark calmly gathered his papers. Security will escort you to collect your belongings. The word security hit harder than anything else. Blake froze, the reality settling in. In minutes, 2 uniformed guards would be watching while he cleaned out his office. His pride burned hotter than his anger. He looked around the table one last time, eyes darting between Camille, Mark, and Greg. You're all pathetic, he spat. This dealership was mine before any of you showed up. Camille met his glare. Then maybe that's the problem. For the first time, he didn't have a comeback. He left the room, shoulders stiff, but the hallway felt longer than it ever had. People peeked from their offices as he passed. No one spoke. His reputation, the one he'd built for a decade, was crumbling in real time. Inside his office, security was already waiting. Blake grabbed a cardboard box from the cabinet and began filling it with his things. Photos, cufflinks, trophies, his framed top salesman award. His hands shook as he set the keys to his BMW on the desk. Won't be needing these, he muttered bitterly. One of the guards, a young man barely out of college, nodded politely but said nothing. When Blake walked out, the receptionist whispered something to a co-worker. He didn't catch the words, but he didn't need to. He knew they were about him. Each step toward the exit felt like another piece of his pride being stripped away. Outside, the late morning sun was blinding. He stopped by his car, the box heavy in his arms, and tossed it onto the passenger seat. Then he just sat there for a long time, staring at the building that had been his second home. Through the glass walls, he could see Camille speaking with Greg. Composed, calm, not triumphant. That somehow stung worse than anything else. She wasn't celebrating his downfall. She was simply moving forward. He slammed his hand against the steering wheel. Unbelievable, he whispered. 10 years gone. He started the engine and pulled away, the tires crunching over gravel. Back inside, Camille returned to her office and closed the door behind her. She took a deep breath, sat down, and opened her laptop. There was no satisfaction in her face, only relief. Relief that a toxic chapter had finally closed. She knew rebuilding Ridgeview's culture wouldn't be easy. Trust took time. But at least now, the path was clear. For the first time since she'd arrived, the air in the building felt lighter. Yet while Camille looked ahead, Blake was already looking back. That afternoon, in a small cafe on the edge of town, he sat with his laptop open, typing furiously. Resignation posts, emails to old contacts, plans to start something new. His pride had taken a hit, but not his ego. By the next morning, the story had already started to spread. Top salesman fired for sexist remark. It was everywhere, group chats, dealership gossip, even a LinkedIn thread. And as Camille walked through the showroom greeting her team, she overheard one whisper that made her pause. Maybe this place finally has a chance. She didn't respond. She just smiled faintly and kept walking. The storm was over. Or maybe it was only beginning. Echoes of a fall. It began with whispers among former employees, then screenshots of vague Facebook posts, and finally a Reddit thread titled, Luxury Car Dealership Exec Fired for Disrespecting His New Boss. No names at first, but the details were unmistakable. Ridgeview Motors, Atlanta suburbs, male senior employee, new female manager. Within hours, the internet was guessing. At a coffee shop a few miles away, Blake scrolled to the thread with a sinking feeling in his chest. Each comment felt like another hit. He got what he deserved. Good for her. About time someone stood up to that type. Imagine losing a 6-figure job over your ego. He shut his phone off and stared out the window. 10 years of building his image, gone. Not because of poor sales or scandal, but because of one sentence he couldn't take back. At home, Janet tried to stay calm. She brought him coffee, spoke softly, avoided saying the wrong thing. But she was scared too. Their mortgage, their lifestyle, everything depended on his income. What are you going to do now? She asked one morning, sitting across from him at the kitchen table. I'll find something else, he said automatically. Dealerships are always hiring. Not when you got this following you online, she said quietly. He glared. You think I'm done? I think people talk, Blake. And right now they're not saying good things. He pushed back his chair, standing abruptly. I'll handle it. But handling it wasn't easy. He called 3 former colleagues that afternoon. 2 didn't answer. The third said, Man, I'd help you, but corporate's nervous. HR's keeping an eye on anyone tied to this thing. Back at Ridgeview Motors, the tension that had hung in the air for weeks finally began to fade. The atmosphere was calmer, lighter. People worked with quiet focus. For the first time in years, no one was walking on eggshells around the top salesman. Camille noticed the difference immediately. She made small changes, updated the client feedback system, replaced outdated sales scripts, introduced a mentorship program for junior reps. Nothing radical, just progress. One afternoon, she called a brief meeting. Employees gathered, uneasy, unsure what to expect. I'm not here to talk about what happened, she began calmly. What's done is done. What matters now is how we move forward. We're a team, and everyone here deserves respect, no matter your title, background, or years in this business. Silence followed, but people nodded. Even Greg looked relieved. Afterward, employees lingered in small groups. She's actually pretty solid, Jared Lopez whispered. Yeah, another replied. Feels different around here now. Better. Camille overheard but didn't react. She just smiled and walked back to her office. Outside the dealership, though, the conversation was only heating up. Someone had leaked Blake's full name to the Reddit thread. A blurry photo from the staff meeting surfaced online. That was all the internet needed. Within 48 hours, his LinkedIn profile was flooded with comments, some mocking, others furious. A few offered sympathy, but most didn't hold back. When you treat people like props, don't be surprised when they move on without you. That night, Blake deleted his account. The worst moment came when his teenage son, Eli, walked into the living room holding his phone. Dad, are they talking about you online? Blake froze. What are you talking about? Eli handed him the phone, a screenshot from a viral TikTok video. Someone was reading the Reddit thread over dramatic music. The caption read, Luxury salesman gets fired after sexist comment, justice served. Janet covered her mouth. Oh, God. Blake's chest tightened. He wanted to throw the phone, to scream, but instead he sat down, feeling the full weight of what he'd done. It's all lies, he muttered, though even he didn't sound convinced. Eli looked at him quietly. Maybe you should just say, sorry, Dad. Blake stared. You don't understand. Maybe not, Eli said softly, but people might listen if you did. The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. That night, Blake opened his laptop and tried to draft a public apology. He wrote, deleted, rewrote. Every version sounded hollow. He couldn't bring himself to hit post. Meanwhile, Camille received a message from corporate. Thank you for how you handled the situation. You've set a strong example of leadership under pressure. She didn't reply immediately. Instead, she sat back, thinking about a fine line between justice and empathy. How even when you're right, the fallout still leaves scars. Outside her window, the sky glowed orange and pink, the kind of quiet evening that feels like a new beginning. For Camille, for Blake, it was the aftermath of a storm he created and didn't know how to survive. The following weeks blurred into one another. The house was too quiet. The refrigerator's hum felt louder than it should. The absence of ringing phones and voices gnawed at him. He tried to stay busy, cleaned the garage, reorganized old trophies, refreshes resume. But every task ended with the same hollow silence. When recruiters called, the conversations were polite, but brief. They'd seen the stories, even if they didn't say so. The internet never forgets. At night, Blake sat in the dark living room, staring at the blank television screen. Janet would peek in sometimes, but rarely spoke. They were both too tired for another argument. One evening, he opened his laptop again. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. This time, he didn't write excuses. He didn't try to defend himself. He just typed, "I said something cruel. I disrespected someone who deserved better. I lost my job because of it. And I understand why. To anyone I've ever made feel small, I'm sorry." He read the words twice, then hit post. He didn't know if anyone would believe him, but when he closed the laptop, for the first time in weeks, the silence didn't feel quite so heavy. At Ridgeview Motors, Camille was in her office finishing reports when Greg knocked gently on the door. "Just want to say," he said, "the place feels good again." She smiled faintly. "That's the goal." He nodded. "You handled it better than most would." "Handling it is only the start," she said quietly. "Now we rebuild." Outside, the dealership lights reflected off rows of polished cars, each one gleaming in the dusk, a symbol of renewal, of motion forward. And somewhere across town, Blake sat alone in his driveway, watching the same fading light, unsure what came next, only that it had to be different. Sometimes, losing everything isn't the end. Sometimes, it's the first honest beginning. Seconde chance. The days blurred together. Blake stopped shaving. He checked job sites every morning, but every time he saw a listing that matched his experience, his stomach tightened. The car industry was smaller than people thought. News traveled fast. His name wasn't just online, it was in inboxes, whispered in conversations between managers. One morning, he drove to a dealership in Roswell just to talk. He wore a crisp suit, polished his shoes, printed his resume. The general manager, a man named Rick Donnelly, greeted him with polite professionalism. They shook hands and sat across from each other in Rick's office. "So, Blake," Rick said, glancing at the resume. "Impressive numbers. Ridgeview Motors, right? You had a strong run there." Blake smiled weakly. "Yeah, 10 years. Top sales for most of it." Rick hesitated. "Mind if I ask what happened?" Blake's throat tightened. New management. Different philosophy. Things didn't line up. Rick studied him carefully. "You mean the situation that's been online?" Blake's heart sank. "You've seen that." "It's hard not to," Rick said gently. "People talk. Look, I'm not saying I believe everything I read, but it's a tough look, especially right now. Companies are careful about optics. So you're not hiring me," Blake said flatly. Rick sighed. "I'd love to. You're talented. No question. But corporate would never sign off." "I am sorry, Blake." Blake nodded slowly, stood, and shook his hand. No hard feelings. But there were. He drove home without music, the kind of silence that pressed against his chest. That night, he sat on the porch with a beer, staring into the darkness. Janet joined him quietly. "You went to Roswell today," she said softly. "How did it go?" "Not great." She looked at him for a moment before saying, "Blake, maybe this is your chance to change direction." He let out a bitter laugh. "Change direction? I'm 43, Janet. My direction's set." "Then maybe that's a problem," she said, and went back inside. Her words lingered long after she left. That night, he couldn't sleep. He scrolled through old photos on his phone, dealership events, team dinners, award ceremonies. In almost every picture, he was in the center, smiling wide, holding trophies, shaking hands. But looking closer, he noticed something he'd never seen before. The people around him didn't look happy. Their smiles were small, polite, distant. For the first time, he wondered if he'd been blind all along. Meanwhile, Camille was thriving, though she wouldn't have described it that way. She worked late most nights, often long after everyone else had gone home. Her focus wasn't revenge or validation. It was rebuilding something that had been cracked long before she arrived. One evening, Greg stopped by her office. "You've done a lot in a short time," he said, leaning on the doorframe. Camille smiled faintly. "Still a long way to go, but the team's responding well." "They respect you," Greg said. "Respect isn't automatic," she replied quietly. "You earn it by showing people who you are, not by telling them who they should be afraid of." Greg paused, realizing she wasn't just talking about the team. She was talking about Blake. At home, Blake found himself watching sales training videos on YouTube, something he hadn't done since his early 20s. He wanted to feel connected again, even if it was through strangers. One night, he clicked a clip titled Leadership Starts with Listening. The speaker, a middle-aged man in a blue shirt, said something that stopped Blake cold. Arrogance feels like confidence to the person who wears it, but to everyone else, it's just noise. Blake froze the video. His reflection stared back at him in the darkened laptop screen. He saw himself interrupting, bragging, dominating meetings, mocking new hires, treating coworkers like competition. He rubbed his face with both hands and whispered, "God, I was noise." The realization didn't erase what happened, but it cracked something open inside him. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts. His finger hovered over Camille's name. She was still in his work directory from when his phone synced with the company system. He didn't call, not yet, but the thought stayed with him. Maybe someday he would. A week later, he got a small freelance opportunity, helping a used car lot indicator modernize its sales process. It wasn't glamorous. No polished floors or espresso bar, just worn desks and honest faces. The owner, Derek Lowe, was a calm, unpretentious man who greeted him with a firm handshake. "Everyone deserves a second chance," Derek said, "as long as you're willing to do the work." Blake nodded. "I am." For the first time in a long time, humility settled over him. He listened more than he talked. He asked questions. He learned. The pay was modest, but the work was honest. Derek treated everyone the same: mechanics, salespeople, even the teenagers who washed cars after closing. That humility rubbed off on Blake more each day. A month later, the morning air felt lighter. The world hadn't gone back to normal. He wasn't sure it ever would, but something inside him had changed. He no longer woke up angry or panicked. The bitterness that once sat in his chest had faded, replaced by something quieter. Regret, maybe. Awareness. He was still working part-time at Derek Lowe's lot. One afternoon, after finishing with a customer, Blake stayed behind to help a new hire close her first deal. She was nervous, stumbling over the paperwork. He smiled gently. "Take your time. The sale doesn't matter if the customer doesn't trust you." She looked up, surprised by his patience. "You used to run a big place, right?" "Yeah," he said, glancing toward the dusty window. "Thought I had it all figured out." "And now?" she asked. He paused, considering. "Now I'm still figuring it out." When the deal closed, the young woman grinned. Blake felt something he hadn't felt in months, a small, honest pride. That night, as he drove home, the city lights blurred across his windshield. For the first time since everything fell apart, the silence in the car didn't feel like punishment. It felt like peace. Maybe, he thought, second chances don't come from being forgiven by others. Maybe they start when you finally forgive yourself. When pride ends. She was fumbling over the paperwork, her hands shaking slightly. "You're doing fine," Blake said, his tone calm and patient. "Really?" she asked, glancing up. "I feel like I'm messing everything up." He smiled faintly. "You're not. Confidence doesn't come from being perfect. It comes from making mistakes and learning from them. Don't be afraid of that." She nodded, a quiet relief in her eyes, and walked away. A moment later, Derek came over, watching him with a knowing look. "You know," Derek said, "a year ago, I bet you wouldn't have had the patience for that." Blake chuckled softly. "You're probably right." Derek clapped him on the shoulder. "Growth's a funny thing. Sometimes you gotta lose everything to figure out who you actually are." That sentence stayed with Blake the rest of the day. That night, sitting on the porch again with the quiet street stretching before him, he finally made a decision he'd been avoiding. He picked up his phone and found Camille's name. His hands trembled slightly as he typed. "Camille, this is Blake. I don't expect a response, but I wanted to apologize. Not because anyone told me to, but because I needed to. You didn't deserve what I said. I was arrogant, defensive, and wrong. Losing that job forced me to see myself clearly for the first time in years. I hope you're doing well. Blake." He read it twice before hitting send. For a long time, He just sat there in the dark, staring at the glowing screen, not expecting anything in return. But 10 minutes later, his phone buzzed. "Thank you for reaching out, Blake. It takes courage to admit that. I accepted the apology before I even read it. Because holding on to resentment doesn't help anyone. I wish you well." Blake exhaled, leaning back in his chair. For the first time since that day in the conference room, he felt real peace. A few days later, he drove to Ridgeview Motors, not as an employee, but as a customer. He wanted closure. The dealership looked the same, but the air felt different. The tension that had once filled the halls was gone. The staff looked happier, more confident. Camille was at the front desk when he walked in. She noticed him immediately. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, neither spoke. Then she smiled, not out of pity or superiority, but simple acknowledgement. "Mr. Hensley," she said softly. "Good to see you." "You too," he replied. "The place looks great." "Thank you," she said. "The team's been incredible." He nodded, hesitating. "You did what I couldn't. You built something better." Camille paused, thoughtful. Sometimes building better just means listening first. He smiled at that. "Yeah, I'm learning that." They talked for a few minutes. Polite, almost friendly, like old colleagues catching up. No tensión, no lingering anger. Just understanding. When he left, he felt lighter than he had in months. That night, when he told Jen about it, she smiled softly. "I'm proud of you. That couldn't have been easy." "Maybe not," he said, but it was right. Later, he sat on the porch again, the same spot where so many restless nights had passed. But now the silence wasn't heavy. It was peaceful. He thought about all the years he'd spent chasing titles, money, validation. He'd mistaken arrogance for strength and dominance for leadership. But Camille's strength had been different. Quiet, steady, unbreakable. She hadn't fought him with anger. She'd simply stood firm and let truth speak louder. And that's what changed him. The next day at work, when a young mechanic accidentally scratched a car door, Blake didn't yell. He grabbed a cloth and helped him buff it out. When a nervous customer hesitated on a sale, he didn't push. He listened, slowly, almost without realizing it. He was becoming the kind of man he wished he'd been years ago. One evening, as he was locking up, Derek handed him an envelope. "Corporate expansion." Derek said with a grin, "We're opening a second lot. I want you to run it." Blake looked up, stunned. "You're serious?" "As a heart attack. You earned it." For the first time in a long while, Blake didn't feel like he was getting what he deserved. He felt like he was getting what he'd become. He shook Derek's hand, holding it firmly. "Thank you. Just promise me one thing," Derek said. "Don't forget what got you here." "I won't," Blake replied, and he meant it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Blake stepped outside, locking the door behind him. The air was warm, the sky streaked with gold. Life, he realized, had a way of humbling you when you least expected it, but also of rebuilding you if you let it. He smiled faintly and whispered to himself, "Guess it's never too late to start listening." And maybe that was a real lesson. Respect doesn't come from position or power. It comes from humility, from treating people as equals, from knowing when to listen instead of talk. If you've ever seen yourself in Blake's story or known someone like him, take this as a reminder. Growth begins where pride ends. Subscribe for more stories that make you think, feel, and remember what truly matters.